There was a house at the end of Mansion Street that no one in town dared to look at for too long. Its dark wooden walls seemed to breathe in the evening light, its towers reaching into the sky like fingers trying to grab the clouds. People walked faster when they passed it. Children crossed to the other side of the road. But for one grieving boy carrying nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, this house was about to become home, and its secrets were about to change everything. Louis had lost everything that mattered. His parents were gone, and with them, the warmth, the laughter, and the feeling of being loved. He was left with silence, emptiness, and a toy shaped like a snooker ball, the last gift they had ever placed in his small hands. When a letter arrived from an uncle he barely knew, with a bus ticket tucked inside, Louis didn't feel hope. He felt like someone had handed him a door when all the walls had already fallen. With nowhere else to go, he climbed onto that bus and let the road take him somewhere new. His Uncle Jonathan was already waiting at the stop, wearing a long coat and an expression that sat somewhere between warmth and worry. He was unusual in the way that interesting people always are. A little scattered, a little mysterious, but his eyes were kind. They drove through the town in near silence, and then, at exactly 7 in the evening, the old church bell began to ring. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Something shifted in Jonathan's face. His jaw tightened. His knuckles went pale on the steering wheel. He tried to smile it away, but Louis noticed. Something about that sound frightened his uncle deeply. When the house finally appeared before them, Louis felt his chest tighten. It was enormous and dark, with Gothic edges and windows that seemed to stare back at him. It looked like something out of a dream you try to forget by morning. But once they stepped inside, the strangeness truly began. Clocks. Hundreds of them, covering every surface, every wall, every shelf. Grandfather clocks, tiny pocket watches mounted in frames, cuckoo clocks lined up like sentinels. And they were all ticking, a chorus of seconds that filled the air and crawled under your skin. Then, without warning, a woman emerged from inside one of the cuckoo clocks, as calmly as someone stepping out of a taxicab. Her name was Florence, and she acted as though nothing about this was remotely unusual. That night, Louis sat alone in his new room, holding the toy his parents had given him, turning it over in his hands. When Jonathan gently suggested he set it aside, Louis looked up with wet eyes and said it was the last piece of them he had left. The room went quiet. Jonathan didn't push. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out handkerchiefs, attempting clumsy magic tricks to coax even the smallest smile from the boy. It didn't quite work, but the effort said something kind. Jonathan left the room softly, letting Louis cry in private, and the house settled into the deep dark of night. But the dark didn't stay quiet for long. A sound crept through the walls, a rhythmic knocking, hollow and persistent, like something buried alive and trying to get out. Louis followed it carefully into the hallway, and there was Jonathan, pressing his ear to the wall, searching with his hands for the source. Before Louis could speak, a nearby cuckoo clock exploded into sound and sent him scrambling back to his room with a pounding heart. His uncle had seen him. Neither of them said a word about it. But from that moment on, Louis knew with absolute certainty that something was hiding in this house, something his uncle was desperately trying to find. Morning brought no comfort. Louis came downstairs to find Jonathan and Florence locked in a fierce argument about whether or not to go inside the wall. The moment Jonathan spotted Louis on the stairs, he went silent, smiled a stiff, unconvincing smile, and told him not to be late for school. The door clicked shut. The arguing resumed. Louis stood in the hallway alone, the ticking of 100 clocks surrounding him, and understood clearly that the adults in this house were frightened of something they hadn't yet named. School was its own kind of battlefield. Louis was the new face in a sea of established friendships, invisible in the way only lonely children can be. During basketball, no one chose him. No one made space for him. Then a boy named Tarby raised his hand and said to give Louis a chance. Louis played terribly. He missed every shot, turned the ball over, and cost his team the game. Walking off the court, burning with embarrassment, He expected Tarby to disappear like everyone else did. Instead, Tarby walked beside him and asked for a favor. He wanted Lewis's vote for class representative. It wasn't exactly friendship, but in that moment, Lewis would have taken anything that felt close to it. Later at the park, Tarby invited Lewis to hit baseballs in the fading afternoon light. It was easy and unhurried, the first time Lewis had felt anything close to normal since his parents died. But when Tarby asked where Lewis lived, his face changed the moment Lewis told him. He stepped back slightly and said the place was a slaughterhouse. An old man had died there, he said. The house was haunted. Lewis laughed it off at first, but then the image of Jonathan pressing his hands against the walls in the dark came back to him, and the laughter faded. Tarby grinned and suggested maybe his uncle had been out there looking for an axe. The joke wasn't funny. It stuck in Lewis's chest like a splinter. That night, Lewis sat on his bed staring at a photograph of his parents, tracing their faces with his finger. Then the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and his mother was standing in the room. She looked exactly as he remembered, her voice soft and certain and familiar. Lewis told her everything, that the house felt dangerous, that his uncle was hiding something. His mother looked at him steadily and said he was in danger. She told him he needed to find a book and a key, that only then would he be safe. Before she could say another word, a clock rang out like a thunderclap, and Lewis woke up gasping. He sat in the dark, heart hammering, trying to convince himself it was just a dream. But every part of him refused to believe it. Something changed in Lewis after that dream. Fear and courage began to wrestle inside him, and courage won, barely. He slipped out of his room and followed the sound of his uncle's footsteps through the shadowed corridors until he reached a room he had never seen before, a room filled floor to ceiling with dolls, their glass eyes catching the dim light. And at the center of it all, Jonathan was swinging an axe at the wall. Lewis's mind went blank. His body made the decision for him. He ran. He threw open his suitcase, stuffed in what he could grab, and rushed toward the front door, his breath coming in terrified bursts. But the house had other ideas. The stained glass window near the staircase rippled like water and slowly shaped itself into two words, "Don't go." Then the suit of armor in the corner turned its helmeted head toward him. Lewis swung his suitcase at it, clattered it to the floor, ran, scrambled, and kept running. Every clock in the house suddenly began spinning wildly, their hands whirring like the whole building was losing its mind. An armchair dragged itself across the floor and planted itself squarely in front of the main door. Lewis hammered at the wood, screaming to be let out. Jonathan appeared behind him in the hallway, calm as still water. Lewis spun around, chest heaving, and demanded to know if the house was haunted. Jonathan looked at him for a long moment and then said quietly, almost warmly, that the house wasn't haunted. It simply liked him. What followed was the kind of conversation that rearranges the entire world. Jonathan brought Lewis into his study and told him the truth. He was a wizard. This house was alive. The knocking in the walls was the sound of a magical clock, built by a man named Isaac who had once lived here with his wife Selena. They had constructed it and hidden it deep within the structure, and its ticking had never stopped. Lewis absorbed all of this with wide eyes, then asked the question that had been building inside him since the moment he arrived. Could anyone become a wizard? Jonathan smiled and said yes. And when Lewis asked to be taught, his uncle agreed. The weeks that followed were filled with dusty books, failed spells, and small, impossible wonders. Lewis levitated Jonathan by accident, sparked electricity from his fingertips, and promptly lost control of it, and once managed to make the kitchen chairs rearrange themselves into a perfectly symmetrical pattern without meaning to. But the most breathtaking moment came in the garden, when Jonathan told him to place his hand on a large stone clock. The moment Lewis touched it, the sky around them folded open like a book, and a miniature universe bloomed into existence. Stars, planets, light, and darkness, all spinning slowly around them as if they had stepped into the heart of creation itself. Lewis stood there speechless. He had never felt more alive. But underneath the wonder, something was quietly unraveling. Florence came to Jonathan one evening with news that turned the color from his face. The clock inside the wall was chiming less and less frequently. The number was shrinking. Whatever the clock was counting down to, it was getting closer. She said the word omega like she was afraid of it, the last letter of the Greek alphabet, the symbol for the end. They didn't tell Louis. They kept their fear tucked behind closed doors, but the house felt it, and Louis felt the house. At school, Tarby had won his election, exactly as Rose had predicted he would. She was a quiet girl with sharp eyes who told Louis plainly that Tarby collected people the same way a hunter collected trophies, useful until they weren't. She offered to simply be his friend. Louis barely heard her. He was already inside his own head, calculating, planning, desperate to prove himself. He told Tarby that his house wasn't haunted but magical, that his uncle was a real wizard, and that he was learning too. Tarby's eyes lit up in a way that should have been a warning. Louis saw it as admiration. He made a promise he never should have made. That night, under a sky heavy with clouds, the two boys crept through an iron gate and into the cemetery. Louis carried the dark magic book under his arm. The one Jonathan had locked away. The one he had broken every rule to take. They wandered between the graves with a flashlight until the book itself began to move, pulling toward one direction, then another, until it stopped at a single modest stone. Louis drew a star on the cold earth, pressed his cut finger to the page, and read the words aloud. The ground began to tremble. Something beneath the soil shifted. Both boys turned and ran without looking back, and Louis convinced himself in the darkness that maybe nothing had actually happened. Morning destroyed that illusion completely. Jonathan went to the doll room at dawn and found every figure dancing with glee, their painted smiles wider somehow than they had been the night before. He went pale. He ran to the cemetery and stood before the open grave, and the full weight of what had happened crashed down on him. Isaac was back. The man who had gone to war and returned as something darker, who had spent his final years building a clock designed to unravel time itself, who had died in a ritual so violent it shook the foundations of the house, was walking in the world again. Jonathan returned home and began sealing every entrance with horseshoes. His hands were shaking. When Louis came to speak to him, he was too frightened to stop and listen. He sent the boy to Florence's house and went back to fortifying the walls. Florence sat Louis down and showed him a poster from a long time ago. Jonathan and Isaac, young and smiling, performing magic together on a stage. She told him the whole story, how they had been the closest of friends, how Isaac had gone to war and vanished in the Black Forest, how he had come home changed in ways that couldn't be undone. She told him about the dark ritual, the key made from bone, and the years of searching for the lock it was meant to open. Louis sat still and listened to all of it, and when she finished, the weight of what he had done began pressing down on him like stone. He went to Tarby and tried to explain. Tarby hit him and walked away. Louis stood alone in the street, and for the first time, he understood what Rose had been trying to tell him all along. But before he could fully sit with that understanding, the world inside the house turned violent. Books flew from shelves and hurled themselves at him with terrifying precision. A crow watched from the windowsill with knowing eyes. Jonathan and Florence arrived just in time to drag him away from the chaos, and when Louis finally told them what he had done, the silence that fell between the three of them was heavier than any clock in the house. The truth came out all at once. Isaac's clock was not just a magical curiosity. It was a weapon designed to turn time backward, aging every living thing in reverse until humanity ceased to exist. And it would activate during a lunar eclipse. Tonight's eclipse. The chimes had been a countdown all along, ticking toward an ending. Louis felt the full horror of it settle into his bones. He had been a piece in someone else's game, moved into position by a hand he hadn't seen coming. They raced home and found the horseshoes burned, the pumpkins destroyed, and the protection gone. Isaac had already been here. Inside, the house was torn apart, every drawer pulled out, every shelf ransacked. He had been searching for the key. They tried to destroy it themselves, with fire and chemicals and every spell they knew, but the key held. It refused to break. Then Louis found the courage to say the words he had been swallowing for hours. He stood before his uncle and said, "I did this. I brought him back." Jonathan's eyes went dark with fury. The argument that followed shook the walls. And then both adults walked away to think, leaving Louis alone in the wreckage of what his choices had made. He stepped outside for air and saw, through the neighbor's window, Isaac standing perfectly still. Louis ran to the house and brought the neighbor, Mrs. Hanchett, back with him, screaming for Jonathan, hammering on the library door. But the door wouldn't open. When the knock came at the front door, Louis told her not to answer. She answered anyway. Isaac stepped inside, looked at the woman beside Louis, and smiled at her like someone greeting a partner after a long journey. And then the mask came off. She wasn't Mrs. Hanchett at all. She was Selena. She had been living next door the entire time, watching, waiting, playing the role of a harmless neighbor while Isaac gathered his strength. Louis had been their instrument from the very beginning. The dream visits, the voice of his mother, the gentle pushes toward the forbidden book, it had all been Selena, wearing his grief like a costume to manipulate him. Jonathan and Florence broke free just as the trap was springing shut, but not fast enough. They were caught, chained, their magic stripped away. Louis was locked in a cage suspended above a row of iron spikes. Jonathan, even now, tried to reach Isaac with words, asking what the war had done to him, asking where his old friend had gone. And Isaac answered honestly for once. He described the forest, the defeat, the darkness, and the demon that had found him in his lowest moment and planted the seed of the clock inside his mind. He had been growing that seed ever since. There was no anger in his voice. There was only certainty, and that made it worse. Everything that happened next moved at the speed of chaos. Florence broke free with one last burst of power and threw Selena across the room. The cage swung dangerously. Louis grabbed the walls and held on as Jonathan crawled through the grinding gears of the massive clock below, shrunken by the machine's backward magic into something between a man and an infant, his face still adult, but his body impossibly small. Louis followed him into the machinery, without thinking. A gear the size of a carriage wheel came rolling toward them. There was no time to think. Louis reached into his pocket and pulled out the toy his parents had given him, the small snooker ball they had pressed into his hands on the last day he ever saw them. He threw it into the mechanism. The gears jammed. The machine screamed. Isaac and Selena poured more power into the clock, pushing it past its limits. And in that moment, somewhere between grief and fury and love and loss, Louis found the thing inside himself that all those weeks of practice had been building toward. He reached for the electricity he had never quite been able to hold, gathered it, shaped it, and sent it back through the machine like a wave breaking against a cliff. It hit Isaac and Selena full force. They stumbled. They shrank. The magic turned backward on them, the same magic they had aimed at the world, and they became younger and younger still, until there was nothing left of them at all. The clock went silent. The gears stopped. Jonathan, sitting among the dust and debris, slowly grew back into himself, blinking with an expression somewhere between dignity and deep embarrassment. In the garden, they found Florence sitting against the fence, catching her breath, her wand repaired, the octopus apparently having given up. All three of them stood together in the cold, quiet air, and then, without a word, they held onto each other. The house exhaled. The clocks kept ticking, but gently now, like a heartbeat instead of a countdown. The danger was over. The secret buried in the walls had been found, and the boy who had helped plan it had also been the one to end it. Louis went back to school. Tarby walked past him in the hallway without a second glance, already looking for his next useful friend. Louis watched him go, and then turned around and walked toward Rose, who looked up from her book with a small, knowing smile. He sat down beside her, and they talked about nothing important for a long while. He kept learning magic, kept filling the dusty old books with notes in the margins, kept surprising his uncle and himself in equal measure. The house still ticked. The walls still breathed. But Louis no longer feared the sounds in the dark. He had learned that the most dangerous secrets are not the ones hidden in walls. They are the ones we keep from the people who love us, and the ones we tell ourselves when grief makes us desperate enough to believe anything.